안녕하세요. Thank you first to Ms. Lee and Language World for bringing us all together today. I think we have some exciting day ahead. So today I'm going to help describe for you what exactly the Lexile framework is and try to help illustrate where Lexile measures are found, but most importantly, we're going to talk about how Lexile measures are being used, the kind of information that they can provide, and the way that they can be helpful to day-to-day teaching and instruction, and also for perspective on one's growth in reading ability. And so we'll cover all of these things. So I'll start with a challenge for everybody. It's essentially a cone is one word for it. But what's the right shoe size for a 12-year-old? Anybody have any guesses? It's going to depend on the 12-year-old. We know there are many different shoe sizes that would be appropriate. So we could ask the same question in reading. What's the right book for a 12-year-old? It also depends on the child. And this is where the Lexile framework has really concentrated its efforts. And what we've tried to do is help to differentiate these needs and individualize reading instruction for all students. So the Lexile framework is really a tool. It's not a reading program, it's not a test, it's a tool. And it's a tool designed to be useful in making day-to-day decisions and helping to encourage and motivate readers. What's unique about the Lexile framework is that it provides a scientific way for measuring both a book or a text, an article. So it provides a means for determining the level of a text, but also provides a similar means for assessing the difficulty of the reading skill, rather, for a reader. And this is really the power of the Lexile framework, and I'll explain a little bit more and give you some examples that I hope will be useful to understanding all of this. So there are two concepts to understand and think about, and I think they're very straightforward concepts. But first is related to the book or the materials, and that's the concept of text complexity. And this just says that there are certain features of a text, there are certain qualities of a text that ultimately will decide how difficult that text is. Similarly for readers, the reading level is really the level at which a reader can collect meaning from a text. They don't become too frustrated, they understand what they're reading. But those are two unique concepts. So as I said before, and I'll just remind everyone again, the Lexile framework is not a reading program. It's not a test, although we're linked to many tests, and I'll give some examples of that. It's not related to a specific publishing series. We work with literally hundreds, maybe thousands of different publishers. And it's not educational software, although we do develop technologies that are used and useful in enabling other reading programs and products and services to deliver these benefits. So before we go a little further, just to remind, the Lexile measure describes both the reading ability of an individual and the text complexity, and it puts these onto the same scale. So for a student, the Lexile measure describes their reading level. So in this example, I have a little pen, we're saying that this reader is an 870 Lexile reader. And so she has perhaps taken a test that produced a Lexile measure, and so we now know what her reading level is. Similarly, over here we have a book, a very famous book by Harper Lee, To Kill a Mockingbird. And that book has been measured, and the reading level of that book was determined to be 870 Lexile. And so this is a perfectly matched book for somebody's reading improvement, and I'll explain how all of this works. That's really where we're going next. I'm not really the one to go overly technical, but there is a very fundamental concept to describe, and that's underlying the Lexile framework. It's a causal model, and I'll explain this, but what it does is it takes and relates this reader ability that we're describing to the text complexity to allow us to make a prediction about one's comprehension. And that's very important, and I'll cover that in a minute. The Lexile scale you can think of just like the scale for Celsius. It goes from very low, from 0, to very high, to 2,000, and I'll cover that. But really the power is when you know a Lexile measure for a reader, or you know the Lexile measure for a text, we're able to then forecast the success that a student might have with that text and allow for them to not be overly challenged but not also that it's so easy that they're not learning. And so they're exposed to new vocabulary, to new syntax, and we'll see some examples momentarily. The way to think about what I'm describing is simply a series of dials. And so over here we have the reader's ability. Over here we have the text complexity. And so when they're perfectly matched, in the example that I was just giving, where we had an 870 lexile reader and an 870 lexile text, we would predict 75% comprehension. And there's a great deal of research that supports this notion of properly targeting text in order to encourage students to encounter new vocabulary, to encounter new text difficulty. Now, there are some useful things that we can derive when it's not perfectly matched, and I'll give examples of this. There are situations where comprehension is extremely important and 75% might not be appropriate. Well, we can't change the reading level today for a student, but we can make the book easier. And so what happens is if this dial gets a little bit easier, the comprehension is predicted to go up. So if that 870 lexile student had a text that was, say, 600 lexile, the predicted comprehension would go up to about 85%. Similarly, if the book that was, maybe there's one book that was assigned for the entire class, and we know that that book is 1,000 lexile and the student is 870 lexile, the predicted comprehension is going to be lower, so that student may need some additional support. They may need some additional encouragement or help or even time to work through the text because it's more difficult. There's one thing that I've left out for now, and it's not important, but the other factor that implicates the comprehension is the difficulty of the task. When we're reading, that's one kind of task. It may be that in a test situation, the question itself makes the text a little harder. The task actually can affect comprehension. But for our purposes, we're talking about matching a reader with a text to encourage a positive reading experience. So this is a definition of comprehension that when I was talking about 75% comprehension, what we're saying, and this is a definition that is produced down here by Elfriede Hebert and some other researchers in 1985, that reading is a process in which information from the text and the knowledge that's possessed by the reader combine to produce meaning in the text. And this is measured by a particular task, or in this case, a text. But we're concerned with that interaction that happens between a reader and a text. That's the fundamental thing. Comprehension requires information both from the reader and from the text. So there are three components, essentially, of the Lexile framework that help us to get to this place where this information can all become very useful. Over here we have the Lexile Analyzer. This is a piece of software. And what it does is evaluates different features of a text and processes all of that information, and through a special algorithm that was the result of our research, produces the Lexile measure for a text. And so I'll comment on this a little later, but we have measured literally about 150,000 books to date, and about 400 or 500 million articles, short texts from a variety of places. And so that's done through the Lexile Analyzer. The Lexile map is simply an illustration of the scale. And so I saw, I believe, in the brochure for today, near the back you have an example of the Lexile map. And this is just a way to illustrate or understand a little bit better the scale. So there are example books that are given and at each of the levels. And in this one, which is a slightly other version of the map, there's also some sample texts. So on the website, lexile.com, there's another version of the Lexile map which has several pages and actually offers some sample texts at each of these levels. And so this can be useful to review, and if you don't have a Lexile measure for a student, for example, it provides a reasonable way to try to locate where they may be on the text. We can look at some different examples of some paragraphs and see which one they begin to struggle with, and that can be a useful way. To get a Lexile measure for a reader, we do need a test. And so, as I said before, we don't have our own test, but what we do is conduct research that links other assessments with the Lexile framework, or allows an assessment to produce a Lexile measure. And so I'll give some examples shortly of different tests including some here in Korea. So the primary benefits of what I'm describing is that it offers a scientific way to consider this match, to target text to somebody's reading ability. When I was talking a little bit and introducing myself about running, one of the things I learned is that for improvement, we need to challenge ourselves at exactly the right level. And every day I would train a little harder, run a little farther, maybe a little bit faster. An example that our co-founder, Dr. Malbert Smith, has given many times, he's a tennis player. Well, if he went out and were to play a match of tennis against Roger Federer, he wouldn't do very well. He wouldn't improve. He might not ever touch the ball. At the same time, and I know he would say this, so I'm okay saying with this, if he would play tennis with his gypsaram, with his wife, she would never touch the ball, and so he wouldn't probably improve. And so what we're trying to do is target the appropriate level of text so that a student doesn't become so frustrated that they're not learning, that they're not improving, that they're never touching the tennis ball as it comes across the court. But we don't want to make it so easy for them that they're not focused, that they're not concentrating, that they're not learning and discovering new features of the language. Something else that's very compelling, and we'll look at some examples of this, is that it allows teachers to really track a student's progress towards what's really important, which isn't a test that they might be taking next week, although certainly tests have an important role. But we want our students to be prepared for success when they enter universities, for success when they're adults and working in the workplace and may have an opportunity to use English. And so we've been very involved in the United States in something called the Common Core Standards for English Language Arts, which has helped to quantify, using Lexile measures, the difficulty of text that's expected of students when they enter the workplace or when they enter university. And so I'll show you some examples of that research and some of that work a little bit later. What else is very helpful is that Lexile measures and text complexity, this notion of text complexity, are useful not just in the studying of English, but also in all interactions with text. So they really are a way to help improve learning. An example that we often give is a biology teacher who might be teaching a lesson on photosynthesis. And the textbook may be at one level. Everybody has the same textbook. But we know, just like the shoe sizes, that there's a range of abilities in the classroom. And so what the Lexile framework allows you to do through some of these resources that I'll describe, I mentioned that we've measured about 500,000 articles. There's a way to say, I want everybody in my class to read an article on photosynthesis, and using some databases, library databases that are available, allows a student who might be 600 Lexiles to find an article on photosynthesis, and a student who is 1,200 Lexiles in the same class find a similar article on photosynthesis. So they would both be equally challenged in their reading and equally challenged in their learning. So as a supplemental tool to enhance that kind of classroom instruction, it's useful not just in the context of reading, but elsewhere. And so this concept is really this notion of differentiation. It really helps us to individualize education, and particularly the practice of reading outside of the classroom for individual students. And what else is exciting and I love to talk about is the ways that Lexile measures can be helpful not just to a teacher and not just to a student, but also to parents. We really founded our company on the notion that tests, there were many tests, and the information was not always useful. What do I do with a test score? It's helpful in understanding a student's ability at a particular time, or maybe organizing a classroom, providing some additional information about how well students are improving. But it's very hard for a parent, somebody, to go home and know exactly what they can do differently today to help their child improve. And so the Lexile measures are intended to be useful for all stakeholders in a child's education, not just educators and students themselves. So this concept, again, is just to illustrate that it's a unified metric. It provides a way to match and monitor the reading ability and the text difficulty and try to find that right balance for improving learning. The scale, as I've said before, goes from 0 lexile, actually below. It's like temperature. You can actually go very, very low on the scale. But for practical purposes, a beginner starts at about 0 lexile, and it goes all the way to 2,000 lexiles and above. And I'll give examples of some various kinds of texts that we've measured to help show what kinds of texts become very difficult and what kinds of texts are very, very easy. Readers, I've described a little bit about how texts are measured, which is through this software, the Lexile Analyzer, which, by the way, and I believe this is printed in the brochure, but if not, you can go to our website. The analyzer is available for free. You can sign up, and if you have materials or are curious the difficulty, you can sign up for the analyzer and measure text. And so assessment, as I said, determines the Lexile measures for individuals. And so that would be a text, or a test rather, that we've built using Lexile Scale. And so an example of that would be the Scholastic Reading Inventory. We worked with Scholastic to help develop that assessment and produce items and scoring tables and all of the kinds of things that go along with an assessment. But really, much of our work has been linking other assessments. And so that includes in the United States things like the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It includes internationally things like the TOEFL exam. We've worked with ETS to link the TOEFL and the TOEIC. And here in Korea, the TOEFL Junior is a test that was built that links to the Lexile Scale. And so this is actually a scientific process, and we're going to move past this fairly quickly since we want to talk about the implications for teachers. But we basically conduct research with people who are known as psychometricians. And what we do is create parallel forms, parallel tests that we believe match, and administer both tests, and then through a very rigorous process of analysis and technical review are allowed to report a Lexile measure based on a score that a student gets on a particular test. So this technical detail is also all available on the website if anybody is interested. Dr. Smith, who I mentioned earlier, likes to talk about psychometricians. He has a very funny story about being introduced once as a psychomagician, because this all seems like magic, but in fact it is highly reviewed work that allows us to report Lexile measures for about 35 million students today in the United States. And so these are the kinds of assessments that we're linked to. We have about half of the states in the US that now report a Lexile measure. Norm-referenced assessments, things like the Terra Nova and the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, and formative assessments and reading programs, and publisher titles. As I mentioned, we work with probably 1,000 different publishers around the world to always be measuring texts. These are just some examples that I was just giving, talking about how extensively the Lexile measures are being used in the States. And increasingly, we're starting to link assessments that are used in Korea and internationally. So here in Korea, there's a company called Natmal who sells a test called the ELQ, which reports a Lexile measure. I met with Natmal earlier this week and was very excited to see that they've now created a mobile app, the MBT, which you can get in the Android or iOS store, and for a very reasonable fee, I believe, get a Lexile measure. The TOEFL IBT test, the TOEFL Junior test, the TOEIC test today in Japan reports a Lexile measure. And we've been in a number of discussions about linking many of the local tests that are used here in Korea, and also are doing some exciting work with some companies to bring some additional Lexile assessments into Korea. We also have been doing a considerable amount of work in the new technology, so things like the Smart Learning Initiative here in Korea. And we've developed a simple way to access some of this technology through an online service called Engaging English. And today we have learners in about 125 countries who every day log into this site and get their Lexile measure and are able to access targeted readings. And so I'll talk a little bit about that technology as we proceed. So I want to back up just a little bit, and we'll talk in greater detail about how we measure text and what's important in measuring text. And so the key features, and I think if we were to take a show of hands or take the time to do a survey, we would probably all intuitively understand this. One of those features is the complexity of the grammar and the syntax. A simple proxy for this is the length of a sentence. Longer sentences are harder to understand, and the reason that is true is because they use more sophisticated, pardon me, more sophisticated grammar and syntax. And so the other feature that we look at is the difficulty of vocabulary. And so the simple concept there is less familiar vocabulary, less common words are much more difficult. And today we have a corpus that we use to determine these statistics that's based on all of these texts that we measure. And so we've been told it's one of the largest corpora in existence. It's well over 1 billion words. And so when we analyze things like the difficulty of vocabulary, we're looking at that entire corpus of published texts that have come in from all of these different books and determining words and their difficulties. So this is just a few examples of some books. And so we have, just to show how this notion of stair-stepping, and so books increasing in difficulty. And so a book like Bear Attacks, Scholastic, is 750 lexile. Way over on the right, we have a book that was popular for a while called Guts by Gary Paulson. That was 1230 lexile. But we'll talk a little about why those differences exist. And so many books available, and I'll talk about where you can browse for different titles by lexile measure. This number is a little bit dated, but the periodical articles are at least 500,000 now. We work with a company called EBSCO, which is a library services provider, and I believe they operate in Korea as well. And so every text that they collect, things like Discovery Kids and Time Magazine and all of these different magazines, every article that goes into their database is today processed using the Lexile Analyzer, and Lexile measures are available as a way to search and differentiate instruction. Through this service, Engaging English, we're also now measuring web pages. So we've developed technology that's going out and looking at things like English daily newspapers and measuring articles that exist in those sites. And I'll show some of the summaries of that work in a few slides. And so in the United States, Barnes & Noble is a big bookseller. They enable parents and teachers to come in and search their books by Lexile measure. Amazon, the online retailer, also includes a Lexile search, or very shortly will. We've been working with them. Here in Korea, Interpark Books has a Lexile search, and so you can browse for books, and we're working with a number of others to bring that capability and make it a little easier to get to in Korea. So I'll come back and talk some about this initiative around the Common Core standards in the United States, because there was some very compelling research that was done, and they recognized that the difficulty of text was a very important component for learning and for helping the students achieve greater skill. And so the three factors that they recognized as being important and have documented in these new standards that nearly all 50 states have adopted was that there was qualitative features, and so things like the levels of meaning, the conventionality of the language, knowledge demands. If it's a subject area, there might be prior knowledge that's required to really successfully engage with that text. But there are also quantitative features of the text, the syntactic complexity, the semantic difficulty, and that's really where Lexile measures were involved, was a means for evaluating the quantitative evaluation. And then the third component, which is represented by the blue at the bottom, is this interaction that I was referencing earlier, the relationship between a reader's level and the text or the task that we're asking them to do with a text they're trying to read. And so, again, and we'll look at an example, we need to evaluate, to understand the quantitative demands of a text, we need to look at the syntax and see how sophisticated that syntax is. And a good proxy for this is sentence length. And then for the vocabulary, again, this notion of easier words, more familiar words, are not as demanding on a reader. And so it's really the more challenging words that can start to impede one's fluency and affect comprehension. So now maybe we look at an example, and I think this will be very clear. And as teachers, I believe you will all know this very well already. But this is from a book, Camping is Fun. And so if you examine this text and scan it, there should be some things that jump out. One is what we were talking about with sentence length and syntax. These are very short sentences. By and large, there's not a lot of demand placed on the reader to hold information as they process it. So we went camping. There are also the vocabulary is also relatively straightforward. Not a lot of challenging verbs, fairly simple nouns, and not a lot of adjectives and adverbs and things like that. And so, in fact, this book measured at 200 lexiles. It turned out to be a very low-level text. Now, if we look at another example, which was actually from the inaugural address of George Washington, I struggle with this one actually, so probably revealing a little too much about my own reading level. But all of a sudden, what do we see? Words like vicissitudes. I'm not sure the last time I've used that one, but it was probably today. We also see that these sentences are very long. It takes you have to hold a lot of information in. It'd probably take me a little time to read this whole thing, but things like, on the one hand, a phrase, and I was summoned by my country, another phrase, whose voice I can never hear, but with veneration and love, big vocabulary. I'm not done with the sentence yet. From a retreat which I had chosen with the fondest predilection, that's another difficult vocabulary word, and I'm still not done with the sentence. And so, there's more. In my flattering hopes, with an immutable decision, as the asylum of my declining years, still not done, I'm going to insert some more information. A retreat was rendered every day more necessarily as well, as more dear to me by the addition of habit to inclination and of frequent interruptions in my health. My health is suffering right now, to the gradual waste committed on it by time. Well, in fact, this was an 880 lexile text. And so in this example, again, I think you can see how these features interact, the relationship between syntax and vocabulary. Really now we're going to get to some of the benefits. The Lexile framework is really is the only known developmental scale, which again spans from very beginning reading abilities in texts all the way to very challenging difficulties in text, that puts both of these measures onto the same scale. There are a few closed systems, products or programs that proclaim to do the same thing. So one of the more popular ones is Renaissance Learning and ATOS and AR. But it's a closed system. It only uses their books, it only uses their tests, it only uses their quizzes. And so what differentiates or distinguishes the Lexile framework is that we are very open. So we link to other assessments and other programs, and we measure tens of thousands of texts. But the real payoff comes when we try to match these things. And research consistently supports the notion that reading improves when there's a targeted reading experience. That's the most efficient way to grow one's reading ability. And so in our terms, it's not always requiring of a perfect match. There is measurement error in any measurement, whether it's a text or a reader. But typically the range that we recommend is about 50 lexiles above a reader's measure, all the way down to about 100 lexiles below a reader's measure. And that's where we get this 75% comprehension prediction, which is useful to try to challenge readers and improve learning. It also enables progress monitoring. Because it is a developmental scale, it's a common perspective. And so one of the things that led to the development of the Lexile framework was recognizing that there are literally hundreds of tests. If you're a testing person, you can go to Burroughs' Book of Measurement and find pages and pages and pages of reading assessments. All of those results are different, and how do you compare them? How do you keep a common perspective over time? And so Lexile measures enable you to do that. When we have a Lexile measure from one test, and maybe 2 years later there's a Lexile measure from another test, we're actually tracking progress on a common scale, from a common developmental perspective. And so we get a very useful perspective on growth. And then something that I'll illustrate shortly is that it allows us a very meaningful perspective on that growth because of the work that's been done and the texts that have been measured and the different environments that we've looked at So how do we use the Lexile measure? How do we build a student's reading level, and what does this all mean? So our challenge and our goal is really to try to encourage reading experiences where the student can comprehend sufficiently, where they're not overly frustrated and they don't give up. Another example that we like to give would be one of lifting weights. If I were to put 300 kilos on a barbell right now, I would be not even able to scream. It would probably just crush me. Same thing if it was very light. I might not improve. I might not get stronger. I'm just pumping weight and it doesn't help. And so this is really a way, through science, to start to bring together these concepts and find just the right level to challenge students. And when a student is sufficiently targeted, when they are reading targeted text, they're strengthening their skill as they go. They're encountering new vocabulary. It isn't the case that they're going to understand every single word in a text, and that's by design. But if they understand the context, if they're not overly frustrated, if they're not struggling with the text, then they're constructing new meanings. They're able to build some meaning for that vocabulary that they maybe don't understand. And as the reading level increases, then the level of text that somebody can comprehend will, by extension, increase. And so the ways that we manage this comprehension are this concept of matching text. There's also this notion of scaffolding, which is also very familiar already to anybody teaching, which is that it's the supports that are provided. And so in the case of a book, picture books are a good example. Often for very young readers, there are some pictures, and that supports their acquisition of meaning from the text. In the example I gave earlier of a textbook, which may be very challenging for one reader or a particular reader, all of the kinds of things that you as teachers do to help them understand and interact with that text is a form of scaffolding. And so there are many classroom strategies and different ways to tier reading assignments or assign reading groups. We can talk about those things. One way to help differentiate reading practice is to utilize some of these resources in independent reading or in outside reading. And so finding books that match a student's interest, which is a very key ingredient to keep them motivated. And you can use the book search, whether it was Interpark or we have one on our website to browse all of the titles that we've measured. These are very useful resources to try to use Lexile measures to find reading materials. And we can build supplemental reading lists on different content topics. So again, if we have a topic that we're teaching in the classroom and we know that there's a very wide range of readers in the classroom, we may be able to prepare resources in advance, some at a lower Lexile level for one group of students, some at a higher Lexile level. And then through some of these other resources, something we call web quest activities, sending students out with their Lexile measure to find materials that are online that match their levels. So I'll get into some of the interpretive stuff next, which is, I think, very interesting, and hopefully you will find it interesting as well. But it's important to remember and think about some of the things that Lexile measures are really not designed to address. So they can't tell us much about the age appropriateness of the content. This is actually a strength of using the framework in one sense, because there are materials that are designed or appropriate for adults that are very easy and very hard. There are materials that are designed for very young children that are very easy and very hard. But the Lexile measure does not tell you those things, so it's not always true that a 200 Lexile text is for young children and a 2,000 Lexile text is for professional adults. It doesn't speak to those. It doesn't take into consideration some of the other features and text supports, such as pictures. And so sometimes a book, which may be indicated at a particular level, might have some additional support, maybe a little easier for students to read. We have some codes, which if you're looking through the Lexile book database, you might see some codes for things like pictures book or graphic novel or something. Those are intended to provide some additional information that might help to make a good choice in matching a student with a book. And it doesn't tell us anything about the quality of the book. There are many published books which are simply maybe not interesting or good books. On the reader side, it doesn't also describe things like interest and motivation. Background knowledge is another one. Subject area texts might presume that you've had instruction in that subject area and built up some background knowledge. And so it's not a way to account for those kinds of things. And the purpose and the context of the reading, of course, is something that would come from the classroom. So another point, and we get this question a lot, and this is maybe an important thing to mention. We're not a reading program, as I said before, and so there's maybe a false notion sometimes that the Lexile framework and targeted reading is a way to restrict readers. We absolutely don't encourage that. If a reader is motivated or interested in reading a book, by all means, they should have that book in their hands and they should be encouraged to read it. It might just require some additional support. Go back to that for a minute. I remember several stories when the Harry Potter books were coming out, and you would read about children that locked themselves in the bathroom at night and read the book until its completion. When a student is highly motivated to read a book, it's been our experience, nothing is going to stop them. And so if the book is very challenging to them, they may work harder, and it may take them more time to understand the book. They may reread sections of the book, but we all know that they will have a successful reading experience. And so it's just a point to emphasize that we are definitely not trying to restrict or tell students what they should or shouldn't read. It's just a tool. It's a tool that can be useful in those cases where the additional information is needed. Same thing with topics. So what kinds of things to expect when a student is reading outside of their range? And so when a reader has a text that's more difficult than their reading skill, then they're going to encounter many unfamiliar words to them and some complex sentence structures that might be a challenge. But this can be a very good way to challenge very motivated or advanced readers, encouraging them to take a challenge, to try to read a book that's more difficult, particularly if it's on a topic or a subject or by an author that they're very interested in. There are times when reading below your Lexile measure is going to be a very good idea. Now in that case, they're not going to be challenged as much, they're not going to be building their vocabulary as much, but they may be sitting on the beach and want a nice reading experience that doesn't have a lot of demands. But this can also be a very great way to help struggling readers or reluctant readers, readers who are maybe not as confident in their learning, to have a positive experience. If you have students or readers who, for whatever reason, are intimidated by reading, giving them a text that's at a lower Lexile level can help to build that confidence. We can give them some positive experiences that hopefully change their feelings about reading and start to develop this passion for reading that we're all trying to create. There are a number of different studies, some by the U.S. Department of Education, different reports on the use of Lexile in all of this context. And so all of these studies and many more papers are available if you go to lexile.com, and you can read more about this and find some additional tools. I mentioned many library resources and web resources. This is just a small sample. Here's the company EBSCO at the bottom that I was talking about. Newsbank is another one, Follett. These are very large content aggregators that are all utilizing the Lexile software to measure all of their texts and enable teachers and students to find materials at different levels. This is just a little screenshot of the Lexile English Reading Wizard that today is up on the InterPark site. You can see right here that there's an opportunity to put in either a range of Lexile. So if you are looking for materials that are in a particular range that might be matched to your classroom or to different reading groups, or if you do have a particular Lexile measure, there's a place to put that in. Once you submit that, it filters all of the books and starts to let you browse books that are in that reading range. There's also a feature on this site and on the Barnes & Noble site in the US and the Amazon site where if you don't have a Lexile measure, we ask a few questions, some simple survey questions that help to approximate a reader's Lexile measure. So in the United States, you might select a grade level, you might tell us that I'm an average reader, and we're able to give you a range that would be appropriate. On the InterPark site, I believe they'll give you some sample text. You similarly fill out provide a little bit of information, then it shows you a few sample texts to see if this is looks about right, looks appropriate. Does the text, is it similar to books that the student has had some successful experiences in? And that provides a way to just estimate a Lexile measure for a reader, so we have some idea of where to target our instruction. This is, now I'm going to give some examples of some of the work that we've done on in the Common Core standards, in the English standards in the United States, and some of the insights that we've derived. And then I'll bring that back to some research that we've started to conduct here in Korea, which has found very similar findings, which is, I think, interesting about the state of things. The Secretary of Education in the United States, said one of the key requirements of the Common Core standards for reading is that all students must be able to comprehend texts of steadily increasing complexity as they progress through school. So this is just another way of saying that as a student starts elementary school and proceeds through high school, the complexity of the texts that they're reading, the amount of reading and the difficulty of the text needs to improve steadily if we're going to get them to where they need to be. And so I'll hold here for a minute and try to explain this, but one of the things that we had done was to analyze collections of materials that are found at different grade levels in the United States, and then also in different reading environments, different occupational reading environments. And so what we're looking at here is a representation of these stair steps that I was just alluding to. And so over here, this is first grade, and we measured hundreds of different kinds of materials, textbooks that are commonly used and adopted from different publishers, chapter books and trade books that are often assigned and used for different kinds of assignments at different grades. And so down here, what we found, and what these are box and whisker plots. So the green section is essentially the middle 50%. It's the interquartile range. So this, out of all the materials, this was the middle 50%. So 25% of the materials were harder, 25% of the materials were easier. That's what these little whiskers were. So that just shows you the range. And this is the median right here. So that was the middle. And so what you can see is that for grade 1 in the United States, it was about 300 Lexile was the median. And then you can see the progression of difficulty in the materials that were being exposed to students and to readers at different levels. I'll show you some slides that make this a little bit clearer, but what's important here, this is the line for graduation from high school. And then we measured a variety of different reading environments and materials to look at the complexity there. The wide range one right here, that's from a variety of different workplace environments, and I have a slide that's going to show you in more detail some of those environments. And you, I think, can understand there are some places where the reading demands are fairly low, the materials might be fairly easy. There are some, like law or science, where maybe they get very difficult. This one over here, I think, was the university and the two-year schools. And so you can see the difficulty. Now, one thing I'll point out, and we'll see this again on a subsequent slide, this is really the challenge to educators and to parents and to all of us, is we've recognized that there is a gap between where students have been exiting high school in their reading ability and where students are expected to be reading that first day of university study or that first day on the job. So if you look at this little one right here, this was grade 12, and then look over here at the university. See that? And this was really the key insight, and one of the things that we've been speaking and working with others extensively on was that based on this kind of analysis and this kind of study, there's as much as close to a 200 Lexile gap between the texts that students are reading and where their abilities are when they're exiting high school, and where they're expected to read and be successful when they start in the university. And so again, from the U.S. Secretary of Education, we needed to look at standards that were going to ensure that all students were prepared for successful careers and workplace. And so this was really the motivation behind the development of common standards. In the United States, we have 50 states that all had their own standards, they all had their own tests, and they were all producing different results. Some states were very successful, some weren't. And so this initiative was about recognizing that all students need to be prepared, and we need to begin considering strategies to prepare all our students. A couple more summarized findings from the report that led to the development of common standards. The Appendix A for the standards, which is also all available online, is the one that speaks heavily about this notion of text complexity and increasing text complexity, and so there's some good information there. But not surprisingly, students who fall short in the ACT exam and the benchmarks would have the greatest difficulty with texts that were the hardest. And so they examined, and we worked with ACT on this, their assessments and looked at the students who performed very poorly in reading. And not surprisingly, those were the students where they struggled was not necessarily with the question that was being asked, it was the difficulty of the text that they were asked to read before they answered the question. And so just highlighting that relationship again between the complexity of a text and the asking of students to do other kinds of tasks. We do also do work in writing, and have found similar things. Sometimes, a common way to teach writing is to assign an article or a passage to a student and ask them then to write about it. Well, the relationship between students who are writing very poorly and ones who are very poor readers, and what the hypothesis would be is that they weren't understanding sufficiently of the text, and that in fact was creating additional demands on their writing. Another insight, and this is one that sometimes is difficult to reflect on a little bit, was that over the past half century, when we look back at textbooks that were used 50 years ago and textbooks that are used today, they've actually gotten easier. And so we're kind of moving in some ways in the wrong direction, and maybe that was an attempt to accommodate more students, or maybe that was just a natural sort of evolution, but it did seem to be the case that textbooks were actually becoming a little bit easier, and so that contributed to this issue of the gap. So I'm going to skip past. So this is an illustration just for a student. So this right now is the bottom line right here is the current growth curve that students are essentially on with the current level of readings. And as we can see again, there's a gap between where that student is graduating and the level of the materials that they're going to immediately encounter when they enter the workplace or enter the university. And so our goal now, and the result of a lot of this work, was to prepare students to be college or university and career ready, which really means we need to get them to about 1,300 lexile by the time they graduate. And so a lot of work is being done now to help states implement these new standards and understand that what we really need to do is put students on this top curve. So drawing from some of this work, and I will bring this back to some similar work that we've been doing in Korea, which has found very similar things. But this just highlights, and again this comes from the common standards, the different reading ranges, the text complexity bands for different groups of grades. So there's K1, grade 2 and 3. This is the current lexile band that was observed, and this was the proposed stretch band. So this is the way that we're challenging teachers to get their students to having all students graduate prepared down at this 1,200 to 1,300 level, and which means that we need to raise the reading demands at each of these grades and challenge students more sufficiently. Another finding, and I'm sure as teachers you're familiar with many other measures of text complexity. The reality is on the text complexity side, many of them do a very similar job. They do a very good job of ordering the difficulty of text. And so there is a relationship between lexile measures and things like the reading maturity measure, the Fletcher measure. ATOS, here's Renaissance over here, And so this is also, I believe, documented in the text complexity work for the standards. But what we found was that all of these measures do a good job of predicting the ordering of text. If we took 100 texts and ran them through all of these different engines to measure text, they're going to stack up or rank in approximately the same order. So again, the real power of Lexile is the ability to factor in the reading level of a student and have some useful capacity for predicting their experience and challenging them right. I love some of this information. I was involved in some of the work that did these studies, but this is just breaking out a little bit by some different occupations the reading demands that were observed. And so we looked at materials that were found in agriculture and natural resource professions, things like law and manufacturing. This is just a sample. But over here we can see essentially the Lexile range that was produced for all of these different environments. And so you can see that law and public safety, I was actually happy to see there's a very high level of reading demanded in public safety. I think also you can see here education has a fairly high reading demand, and I think that's both a reflection on how much reading we do in education, but also the importance of reading. This is just a sample of some different kinds of textbooks that we've looked at. So a mathematics book in context, again, a fairly high reading level. And these were first-year university books, so this is trying to elaborate a little bit for you on that college and career readiness or university and career readiness box and whisker plot. These are some of the books that were within those collections. And so you can see a psychology book coming in at $12.70. Had a calculus book down here that came in at $13.80. Even though these books are about mathematics and physics and chemistry and subjects like this, there is still a very healthy reading demand. Reading is still an essential component of interacting with these texts successfully and learning. This one I also found interesting, which is we looked at hundreds, or maybe 100 different English language dailies, newspapers that are online, and found, I think it was surprising, at least a little bit to us, that the reading demands are actually fairly high still in these different kinds of papers. So here we have the Chosun Ilbo in Korea, 1360, right? The Straits Times in Singapore, 1410. There's a misconception, I think, a lot of times that these kinds of casual reading is actually easier. That some of these newspapers, like I don't think it's on this example, but like the USA Today is a very light reading newspaper and fun stories. But what we're finding over and over again is that in an adult context, in the workplace, in universities, in any post-secondary kind of reading environment, the reading demands are consistently, 1,200, 1,300 lexiles and up. So this is really critical to this notion of preparing students to be prepared for those environments. This is just another, it's crooked, I have to look sideways at it, but this is just another example. You can see the range of texts down in high school. This is the SAT exam, the ACT, and another one, the AP. Materials from the military, some different citizenship documents, so things like things from the DMV, the Drivers Bureau, and voting materials. The workplace, again, has a wide range depending on the environment, but universities, and up here was the graduate record exam, the GRE. So even though things like the GRE are asking a lot of different kinds of questions, the reading demands are still very high. We looked in a small study, and we're doing more of this work right now. I've had the pleasure in the past week of visiting several universities, Seoul National and others, to talk about hopefully doing more of this kind of work and sharing our findings in the future. But similarly, in a local Korean setting, are students being prepared for these reading demands, which we're observing in the workplace and observing in universities? We looked at textbooks that were being used in Korean high schools. There was a collection of about 50 textbooks, 45 textbooks. And what we found was the range, the interquartile range, so the middle 50% of those textbooks was about 730 to 940 lexiles. Now, based on the perspective that we've been reviewing right now, newspapers that are online, different kinds of textbooks that a student's going to be handed on the first day of class in the university, different kinds of materials that they might have in their job, that suggests that they're being insufficiently prepared for those demands. And this is a very complex challenge, but I think one that we can address over time. And so the solution is pretty straightforward. They need more exposure to more complex text and more diverse text. One textbook is not going to cut it. They're going to need to read more. They're going to need to read more broadly. And again, the way that we can help, at least the Lexile framework can help, is in providing that sufficient level of challenge as they're encountering different materials. So using the NAPMAL assessment, the ELQ assessment, we had collected some data and looked at 16 and 17-year-old students. And we had to, this was survey data, so this was not highly scientific, but it asked them, how long they had been studying English, how long have they been exposed to English. And what you do see is a relationship that didn't require a lot of research. I think we would all know it, which is the longer they've been studying, their median, the middle of their Lexile measure that we observed is actually going up. So the students with the highest Lexile measures, had reported that they were studying, 13 years or up. The range, again, 580, let's call it, to 860 for those students. And for students 1 or 2 years, it was much lower. And here again, jumping ahead a year, looking at 17 and 18-year-olds, so slightly older students, same thing. There's a nice stair step. They are progressing. The longer they've studied English, the more teaching support that they've had, the more reading that they've done, their levels do increase. But again, even for those students that said they had 13 years of English study, and we're now 18 years old, or I think this would be 19 in Korean years, we see that they're still showing an interquartile range. The middle 50% was still coming out 650 to 966. And so just to kind of summarize what this information means, based on a lot of the other slides that we were looking at in some of that context, we have a pretty good and consistent finding that the reading demands in most post-secondary environments can be thought of as 1,200 to 1,400 lexiles. And so looking at the sample of textbooks, it was 730 to 940 lexiles. And so, that's suggesting, again, we need to also supplement those textbooks with some more challenging materials and materials that are more diverse. Same thing with the high school students. The middle 50% of those students had Lexile measures that were coming out less than 1,000 lexiles. So, very consistent to what was observed in the United States. There's about a 200 Lexile gap today between the kinds of readings that students are doing in high school and the abilities or the skills that they have when they leave high school and what they immediately encounter when they start at universities. And one of the things that we hear often when we talk with folks at universities is, there are so many students that they're entering some of the best universities in the world, and their remedial reading classes are still full. And so they're very bright students, they're very smart students, but they don't have the reading skills that they really should have. I attended Duke University and was fortunate to have a number of international students. We had a very, very diverse population. And I could see this, and there were students who had come from all over the world, and some who would have to work very, very hard on their readings. They just didn't have the reading skill. So very bright students, remarkable inside, much smarter than I was. One student that comes to mind was from China. I think he was working on an MBA. He already had 2 PhDs in biology and nuclear physics or something. Super, super bright guy. But we might have an assignment that was to write a paper or do a case study or do some research, and I would be done with the reading in 1 or 2 nights, and he would be working on the readings a week later. So you can see the disadvantage that he had. He had to spend much more time reading before he could actually get to the assignments. And so that's the challenge that we're really all being given today, is how can we help students close that gap and become better readers. This is just a quick summary of some strategies that are useful for closing this gap. More reading practice, another fairly intuitive one, but this is where Lexile measures can help. We want that reading practice to be targeted. We want that reading practice to be sufficiently challenging but not overly burdensome. And so that's the best way to help improve learning. This practice needs to be extensive. They need to read a lot. It's not enough to just have the one textbook or the one or two books. We need to be encouraging them to read more day to day. And that can only happen over an extended period of time. When I was first had this crazy notion of running a marathon, which, by the way, I've never been athletic. I've never really been one to train and work out, and that was one of the reasons that my wife and I decided we wanted to do this. Was to get off the sofa, put down the book, although I love reading, and go outside and train. If we had gone out that first week and tried to run 30K, I would have quit. I would have been extremely sore. And also, it wasn't a fair expectation to think that 2 weeks before the marathon last Sunday in Gyeongju, I could start my training. It took many, many months of sticking with it. And so it's the same idea with reading. We can't solve this problem in a month or in 2 weeks or potentially in a year. We have to create good habits and encourage students to read more often over an extended period of time. And this is where feedback is useful. That can help students stay motivated to see their progress and put it on a developmental scale. And to the extent that it's self-directed reading, that they make choices about the things that they read, that can be incredibly powerful for creating motivated students, for encouraging them to read. The topics that my son enjoys to read are very different than the ones my daughter enjoys to read, which makes reading time in the evening very, very long because we do address the needs for both of them. But finding what students' interests are is also a powerful factor in trying to help them select materials for outside reading or for supplemental reading to keep them reading and keep them reading over time. I'm going to close here fairly soon. I'll move through this, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other kinds of things that we're working on and some of the exciting ways that I think technology is going to help us. Teaching is going to find many, many new tools in the years ahead as technology starts to come more and more into the classroom. And so a lot of the research that we're doing right now with the Gates Foundation is looking at ways to create different kinds of learning tools and platforms that can provide teachers useful information and free them up to focus on the useful stuff and not take so much time on the others. And so there's some papers, again, that you can see on our website, and we have some others. But there was a book that many of you may have read by Malcolm Gladwell called Outliers. Is anybody familiar with that book? It's a pretty interesting book, but he talks about the acquisition of expertise in really any area. So this is not just applicable to reading, it's applicable to any skill. And they looked at many, many, many examples in this book and found that there were a number of common features that were supportive of these experts. How did they develop their expertise? And so what he found was that it took about 10,000 hours to develop expertise in anything, whether that was chess, or nuclear physics. That expertise took about 10,000 hours, and he gives many, many examples. It's a fun book to read if anybody is interested. It's called Outliers. But these were some of the key features that were also indicated in what he was talking about. That practice should be targeted. If I can just go back to the tennis example, what I really would want to improve, if that was my goal, is to always be playing somebody who was just a little bit better than I was. So I had a chance, I was just always a little bit less in terms of challenge, and that's what targeted practice allows you to do. You have sufficient challenge, but you're not becoming so frustrated. And so you're much more engaged in the activities. Real-time feedback is also an important feature. So I don't want. I'm going to move away from the sports stuff. I'm actually not my thing. But it wouldn't be enough to get feedback on my golf swing 3 months later. It's most useful if I'm getting that feedback today. And so that's another thing that I think technology is going to help with for different kinds of assignments and things, but certainly as teachers and in the classroom, appreciating that being able to provide students that feedback on a going basis is so critical to helping them improve. The next one is this notion of intensive practice. So something that is really done, ideally this is something that's done daily, so that you're always sort of working at it. And then the next one is this idea of distributed practice, and it's the combination of the intensive and distributed practice that was in this notion of 10,000 hours. But as applies to reading, what we're really saying is that it takes many years to become an expert reader, and it's not something that can be done in a month or two. And so what we need to do is encourage regular practice. So ideally this is daily or several times a week, and that we need to also try to ensure that that's something that's being done over a number of years. And the last one was this concept of self-directed practice. And so finding useful ways to practice, useful ways to read when the teacher is not available. And so this is maybe access to more books and resources. And this is an example really, and is just highlighting many of the things that we've been talking about, but I think it's a pretty powerful one to point out for teaching. So one of the big issues around reading in the United States, and I think it applies many places, and not just to reading but to instruction in general, was this idea of summer learning loss. And so you hear this talked about as the summer fade or the summer slide or the summer loss, and essentially it's this. It's that students do pretty well at learning, and when they're with their teachers and when they're in the classrooms throughout the year. But when they're done at the end of spring and they go on their summer break, they're no longer around. They fade. They lose some of what they've gained. And so, if we were to test students at the end of the year and then test students at the beginning of the next year, it's very, very common to see their ability actually decrease. This may sound like a fairly simple and kind of intuitive thing and maybe just kind of a natural thing, they're out of class or whatever, but it has pretty powerful implications for policy and other kinds of things. So we had done some work looking at the difference between low-income students in the United States. So these would be students who probably don't have real supportive parents, probably don't have a lot of books and learning materials around, and they're not challenged. And compared those with high-income students whose parents have much more resources and maybe were much more invested in their education. In Korea, you're fortunate because, as I've come to learn very well, parents are very invested in their students' education, especially moms, and that's really, really wonderful and should serve as a model, honestly, for the rest of the world. But what you're seeing here is the top line are these high-income students. And so from kindergarten, and this continues all the way up. This is just a snapshot through 4th grade. But through kindergarten, you can see that they're growing, and they actually grow over the summer. And that's because, again, they have parents who are very involved in their education. They probably have a lot of books around, a lot of literacy materials around. Parents read to them. They're very active in their education. And so you can see that they have very little slide. This is the summer. This is the summer. This is the summer. So we're keeping them on track. They're growing. Well, what you see down here is the low-income students. Now, there's a couple of things that are interesting to observe. Even though their skill is much less, so they're coming into kindergarten much less prepared, they don't have the same level of skills, notice that they're growing throughout the school year at about the same pace. They're not catching up to where their higher performing students are, but they are growing at a similar pace. And if we jump ahead to 1st grade, look at that. They're growing at a very similar pace. That's because of the job that you all are doing. That's because teachers are effective and are being very successful at growing those students. But look here at what happens to them over the summer. Slide, slide, slide. And what you'll also find is that over the course of this period, this gap right here, the difference between our best students and our poorest students, is actually getting to be much bigger by the time they're over here. And the really powerful implication of some of this work and what we were finding was that this difference, the growth in this gap, could actually be explained by 12, or in this example, 4 or 5, contiguous summers of this loss. So they're going home in the summer, they're not exposed to additional readings and not in an environment that maybe supports their education as much. And what happens is that this slide over 11 consecutive summers is actually responsible for much of the difference that we can see between how they start and how they finish over here. And so what was very exciting, we had worked on some of this with a professor from Harvard, Dr. James Kim, and had tried some different things. And one of them was to look at the implications of trying to get those kids reading, over the summer. Again, maybe not as much of an issue here where you have parents who are very interested in promoting this kind of reading. But what he found, and it was very compelling and powerful, I thought, was that if we could get kids to read as few as 8 books over the summer that were targeted to their reading level, that were at their right reading level, and that were on something that was of interest to them, that alone was sufficient to prevent this slide that we were talking about and make sure those students stayed on this same trajectory up here. So this is where a tool like we have one called Find a Book, where you can go and find the Lexile level of books and match them to your interests. You can click through and select some topics that you might be interested on and put in a Lexile range, has been used. And so we work with many state governments in the United States to promote the benefits of trying to keep kids reading when they're not in school and keep them reading over the summer. And so we have governors who will take their picture and be on the TV and tell everybody that they need to keep their kids reading over the summer. We had one example in Florida, the state of Florida, where they were actually printing some of this information on grocery store receipts and sending people to this website where they can find books and try to encourage that. We had a big program this past year called the Chiefs Summer Reading Challenge, where we had many states, I think it was about 30 states that participated, and would try to take pledges from students. So the teachers would sit down at the end of the school year and try to help them select some books, and the students would pledge that we are going to read these books over the summer, and then the ones who in fact did read the books at the end when they came back to school would get a free book or something else. And so lots of different ways to sort of think about how to apply this, but I think it's important information to keep in mind when you get ready for the break for the summer, to remember that many of the challenges you might face the next year when students come back and are not at the same level that maybe you expected them to be based on where they were, maybe due to the fact that they're not quite getting enough over the summer. And so this is just another example of this tool that allows you to put in a Lexile range, and if you don't have an actual measure, you can select a grade and some different things. And so I'll finish pretty quickly. We're just about done. I know it's been long. This notion of deliberate practice and personalized learning, I think, is going to be a really interesting field and area to watch. There's some really exciting things happening, I know, with smart learning technology here in Korea. One of the organizations that's developing some of this tablet stuff had given me a couple of tablets, and so last night I was in my hotel room playing with all these exciting tools, and once I got past my lack of knowledge on some of the Korean interface kinds of things, I think it was some pretty interesting stuff, and we're seeing examples of these. So just to remind all of these ideas of targeted practice and corrective feedback and intensive practice, all of these things can be implemented in some ways through technology. And so one of the things that we're working on right now with our grant with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is to try to develop some technologies that really try to blend better this notion of assessment and instruction. So many times there's two modalities in the classroom. One, maybe during one period we're focused on a test that's coming up and we have to get prepared for that test. That can take a lot of instructional time away and learning time away from other kinds of activities. And so a lot of these newer technologies are starting to look at ways to build assessment into instructional activities, and are providing some very compelling evidence that these are effective ways to measure somebody's ability and start to give them more immediate feedback. A lot of computer adaptive technologies that are helping to always target students appropriately. The one that I mentioned earlier that we've been working with is called Engaging English. I'll show you a few just quick screenshots because it's not really the idea here to get into a particular technology, but just to show that I think there's more exciting things to come. And really this idea that assessment may move away over the next 10 or 15 years from really formal tests, which have limitations. If somebody sits down to take a high-stakes test, there are a number of reasons that a student might not perform to their best. Maybe there's a jackhammer on the floor up above. Maybe they didn't have breakfast that morning and they missed a few questions because they were distracted or had something going on. And so what's exciting about some of these new models that are starting to blend assessment is that we collect lots and lots and lots of data, which over time becomes very accurate and isn't just based on one experience, but is really based on their day-to-day experience and interactions with text and other kinds of instruction. There are versions of this really all around the world, and I know here in Korea too, but in the technology plan, we're really trying to develop instructional approaches that help to differentiate the classroom and help to individualize instruction for students. You may have heard this talked about before. It's often cited, but the idea that our instructional models today are really the same as they've been for 100 years. We take students based on a particular age or grade, and we put them all in the same classroom, and then they all advance together, really through similar curriculums. And so I think the way that we're starting to see some of these ideas move, or the goal is really to be able to sufficiently challenge every student on a given day to their particular interests, their particular abilities, and start to individualize learning. And that is something that I think as more technology comes into the classroom, it's going to allow teachers to provide that level of personal attention more easily to students. And so that's kind of the big idea. And so, again, we're working with some folks, researchers in the United States, and on some different projects that are starting to try to develop these kinds of personalized reading and writing activities and vocabulary activities, things where students are engaging in particular instruction or doing different kinds of tasks, and these things can be measured very precisely. And so all of this enables very effective and on real-time scoring and feedback. And this notion of perspective and longitudinal perspective across the lifespan, that's just saying, some of what we were looking at earlier, that as early as, second or third grade, at least in Lexile terms, we can be tracking students and seeing whether or not they're on that upper curve that we looked at earlier, whether or not they're on the right track to be ready for the university and to be ready for the classroom. And if they're not, maybe much earlier in their educational lifespan, introduce some intervention that tries to put them back onto the right track. And so the focus really on some of these kinds of activities is to be student-centric, and saying it's not teacher-centric is probably actually not the best way to put it. It's just saying that instead of the teacher being responsible for one collection of students that all have to sort of move along at the same time just for efficiency, that we'll be able to maybe start to be more direct mentors and coaches in one-on-one types of settings. This is again the technology that we're collecting some research on, and it's available just as an illustration of some of these ideas that I'm talking about. This is a reading platform. It's a place where a student can go, and we can see up here this particular student is a 950 Lexile, and what this technology does is it tries to introduce some kind of game-like sort of motivational features. So we're challenging them to read more, and they can earn points and compete against each other and see leaderboards and earn badges for reading diversely, all this kind of stuff. But really the exciting pieces is that when we have their Lexile measure and they come in here to do reading, we have hundreds of thousands of articles. These are coming from websites and other kinds of materials that we've measured, and based on a selection of interests. So this particular one was on art. They're immediately given a list of different articles that match their Lexile levels, that are on their interest. And then the really powerful component of all of this is that there's some computer technology that introduces these little questions real time. So any text, when a student selects it or selects to read it, it goes through and it basically just inserts, takes out some words. And their task as they read through this article, it's not a testing experience. They're encouraged to just read. But as they answer these questions, we're collecting all of this information. And I've found that this is actually a very accurate way to measure students' reading ability. And so what happens is that after every single reading experience, every individual reading experience, we update the Lexile measure for that student. And so the next time they look for articles, maybe they grew 5 Lexiles. The difficulty of all of the articles in the database that's available to them will grow. And so that very next reading is always going to stay right at that optimal level of challenge. And then over time, we can track this particular student. These are all of the different assessments that they had, it looks like, between February and May. And we have a reading goal, which in this case was set to be 1,000 Lexiles, and so just provides that progress monitoring sort of capability. Some other tools to try to challenge them. This was something that gets into those ideas of extensive practice and distributed practice. This is a histogram that shows how many articles were read each week, and the little purple bar is how many, what their average number per week is. And so the extensive practice is saying, let's increase the number of articles that I'm reading each week. The distributed practice is saying, over time, let's increase the average number of articles that I read. Let's stay consistent. And so this is a technology solution to something that can also be implemented certainly in the classroom and certainly by parents. It's just the idea of trying to encourage more reading over time. And what the data is starting to show is that this is exactly how you improve reading skills and get students to be college and career ready. You read diversely, you read frequently, you read over time, and you always read some text that's maybe just a little bit harder than your level. We've gone over all of that, but there is a paper that's available on our website that talks about some of these things and this notion of next generation assessment, and a lot of, again, just ideas of blending assessment and instruction, not having these things be so separate, that we can generate test items much more cost effectively and administer many more. I think I have an example here. Well, I said I wasn't going to go technical on you, but just to make sure, if anybody is sleepy, this might do it. What this illustrates is just some of the underlying data, which is just showing that the Lexile measure that the text that the analyzer produced, so the difficulty of these articles that were being encountered in this platform, we compared that to the empirical difficulty of the text. So we looked at students' answers on those questions and how they performed. And what this is just showing is there was actually a very, very strong correlation between those two things. And so this is just evidence that this particular technology is doing a very effective job of measuring students and a very effective job of targeting text. And so we're doing a number of different studies with this kind of technology right now to look at things like textbooks and try to gather the empirical text difficulties. So these readability formulas are all estimating the text complexity and doing a pretty good job of predicting the text complexity. But we're also able now to do some studies that look at empirically how difficult a wide range of texts are. This is just pulled out one particular student that was in this system. So this student was in the 7th grade. What was exciting about this was really over a 4-year period of time, they had read about 150,000 words, 350 different articles in this particular system. And the way we often use this slide is, what they were able to do is take about 3,000 items, and so we had very good data on this student's growth, and this is the growth trajectory that we have them on, again, towards college and career readiness, which is what we want. But it's just suggesting that there are some very, very efficient ways that we can begin to think about moving assessment into a more background kind of experience and keep kids focused on the instructional tasks, which in the case of reading means getting them to read more. We don't have to separate the assessment experience from the reading experience. We can find ways through things like digital textbooks and some of these new technologies that are being developed to integrate very effective assessments. I just wanted to leave you, very quickly with kind of the punch points. We've covered a lot today, and really you've been a very wonderful audience. But the key things that we need to keep in mind is that our ultimate goal as educators is to be preparing our students to be successful beyond high school. We want them to be successful in universities. We want them to be successful in their careers. There's a wide variety of environments in which they might be challenged to use their English reading. And so the way that we get them there is by steadily increasing the difficulty of the text, being aware of the difficulty of the text. If the student is only encountering texts that are at the same level throughout their experience, or they're not growing the difficulty of the text, they're not going to naturally get there. There's evidence that we need to give them more informational text. Fewer, stories and fiction and all of this are wonderful, but the way that you really build your exposure to the language and to the concepts that are used in the language is to make sure that we're exposing them as well to informational text and different kinds of just a broad variety of text. And then we need to find ways to extend instructional time. And so the example that I gave of summer reading, promoting parents and students to keep reading over the summer, that's an example of extending the instructional time, extending the classroom, challenging them to read for pleasure outside of the classroom, or to do more reading that's not assigned. These are all strategies for extending the classroom. A little embarrassed that this broke. I think the font or something didn't quite work. But I thought this was a very positive quote, and I would just leave you with it today. A teacher affects eternity, and he or she can never tell where his influence stops, and I think that's a very true statement. So there's some links to all these resources and papers and all this kind of stuff, but 감사합니다.